My name is Glenn Perkins. I'm the Curator of Community History at the Greensboro History Museum, if you don't know me. And I want to welcome you all here on behalf of the City of Greensboro Libraries and Museum Department, as well as our nonprofit GHM Incorporated, which supports our exhibitions, our collections, our public programming, and all that kind of good stuff. So I'm really excited about tonight's program, in part because we have some fantastic partners with us for tonight's talk. UNCG Department of History, thank you Greg O'Brien, as well as Guilford Native American Association. And I want to talk a tiny bit about Guilford Native because there's an important connection, and you'll hear it in just a second. Because Guilford Native kind of brings together people from a wide range of tribal communities who have made a home right here in Greensboro. And it's also a pioneering urban Indian organization, almost 50 years old, the oldest in the state, one of the oldest in the country. And in those respects, it's really a representation of what democracy and coalition building and community building can look like here in North Carolina. And tonight's talk connects with an exhibition that we created here at the museum. Maybe you've seen it. It's called North Carolina Democracy, 11 Elections. Anybody seen it? Okay, I'm seeing some hands, good. Because we worked very hard on it. It is about choices and change across 11 elections in our state between 1776 and 2010. And it's also about efforts by people who've been blocked from taking part in those democratic processes at different times. And the insistence of those people who have been blocked to demand an equal share in the pie that we call democracy. We're going to be hearing tonight about what that insistence has meant on the behalf of the Lumbee people. And I'm very excited to hear Professor Malinda Maynor Lowery talk about this. And I'm so excited to have her here. One of our research students from UNC, back when we were doing the first sort of steps of conceptualizing the exhibit, said, you know, when you have a program, when you're doing programs for this, you need to get Malinda here to talk about democracy. And it's taken me like 5 years. But we've done it. And so she is here thanks to the John Floyd Wicker Endowment Fund, which was created by Ruth Wicker in memory of her husband, who was an architect and a lover of history. Ruth Wicker is interesting because Ruth Wicker also bequeathed money to the city of Greensboro to create a tribute to women of Greensboro. And maybe some of you have been to Barber Park Event Center and seen that. It honors, I think, about 50 women at this point who have all contributed to the betterment of our city. And what's cool about the Ruth Wicker tribute to the women of Greensboro and North Carolina democracy is there are some connections there, including people, so there's these tributes to women, including suffragist Laura Cahoon, educator Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown, both of them appear in North Carolina democracy exhibit, community leader Shirley T. Fry, as well as the co-founder of Guilford Native, Ruth Revels. So it's great to have this sort of thread stitching together all these things tonight. So I won't take up any more time. Instead, I'm going to invite Ruth's daughter, Jennifer, on stage to welcome you to tonight's program on behalf of Guilford Native. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. I'm delighted to be here this evening, and I thank each and every one of you for coming out tonight. As the Executive Director of the Guilford Native American Association, you know, we are a small nonprofit that's been here since 1975, and we live and breathe and survive on collaborations. So anytime that the museum picks up the phone to call or we reach out to them, it's just wonderful to be able to say that you have been so supportive of our efforts, and in turn we look forward to continuing these opportunities. And I want to say personally, welcome to the Gate City, Dr. Malinda Maynor Lowery. Malinda is a lifelong friend, pretty much. Our families have been close to one another. Malinda's parents, as mine, were pioneers in their day of promoting and preserving the Native American culture and advocating in every way possible throughout North Carolina and the country. And we are delighted to have you and your beautiful daughter Lydia here this evening. Guilford Native American Association supports over 7,000 indigenous people who call the 11 counties of the Piedmont Triad home. And typically when I say that, folks kind of raise an eyebrow because that's, sounds like a large number. And I think the reason people find it interesting is that you don't see us every day. We have been referred to locally and nationally as the invisible people, the invisible community. As we look around the school system, for example, we have over 30-some Native tribes, different tribes of students in the Guilford County school system alone. So we're out there. Our agency started in 1975 as a group of Native parents, primarily Lumbee families, who had relocated to the Guilford community, were seeking better job opportunities, better educational opportunities for their children, and began relocating here in the late 50s and through the 60s, leaving their rural tribal communities and the reservations to come to an urban area to seek a better life for their family. And today we have generations of folks who family came from the different tribal communities throughout our state, and we are really honored to be able to say that we make a difference here in the city of Greensboro and in Guilford County. When you bring folks from different backgrounds and who share their unique cultures, it makes the community thrive, and we're all better for it. So I'd really like to thank each and every one of you for coming out tonight. We will be hosting our 47th annual powwow out at Country Park once again in September, and would love to see all of you there. Please keep up with us on our social media and our website, Guilford Native American Association, and to know and learn about the different opportunities that we have going on. We have an art gallery for those of you that haven't visited next door to the Greensboro Cultural Center, where we host 5 to 6 exhibitions a year along with different types of programming. So again, I hope everyone sits back and enjoy this evening because you are in for a real delight. Thank you.
I'm the Department Head of History at UNCG, and I'll put in a plug. The UNCG Native American Student Association is having their annual powwow this Saturday. Outdoors at campus. It's of course free, so if you're looking for something to do, please stop by. It's pretty much all day long. It's an honor for me to be part of this event, and I appreciate Glenn inviting me to participate. I'm thrilled to introduce my friend, Malinda Maynor Lowery. Dr. Lowery is a historian and documentary film producer who is a member, as you've already heard, the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. In July 2021, she joined Emory University as a Cahoon Family Professor of American History after spending 12 years at UNC Chapel Hill and 4 years at Harvard. Her second book, The Lumbee Indians and American Struggle, was published by UNC Press in 2018. And the book is a survey of Lumbee history from the 18th century to the present, written for a general audience. Her first book, Lumbee Indians in the Jim Crow South, Race, Identity, and the Making of a Nation, was also published by UNC Press in 2010 and won several awards, including the best first book of 2010 in Native American and Indigenous Studies. Malinda has written over 20 book chapters or articles on topics including American Indian migration and identity, school desegregation, federal recognition, religious music and foodways, and has published essays for popular audiences in venues such as the New York Times. She has won fellowships and grants from the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Sundance Institute, the Ford Foundation, and others. Her current projects include essays on the shared history of Black and Indigenous Americans and a media experience on humor and racial stereotypes with the Smithsonian Institution. She holds a PhD in history from UNC Chapel Hill in 2005. In fact, that's why we have a connection. We have the same PhD mentors, separated by a few years. She also earned her MA in history from UNC Chapel Hill. She also has an MA in documentary film and video from Stanford University. And her BA in history and literature was from Harvard. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lowery.
I'm often the shortest person on the program, so I hope you can see me above the podium. Greg, thank you very much. Glenn and the staff here at the museum, I'm so grateful to have this opportunity. And, you know, none of us would be standing here without Jennifer, without your family, especially your parents, Mr. Lonnie and Miss Ruth. So I want to just like acknowledge them, thank them as ancestors now. I miss them very much. And this is a talk for them. I mean, this is, you know, they were who was in my mind when I was trying to put these thoughts together. So I'll try not to wander off topic too much, but as Glenn and I were sharing a few minutes ago, the problem with history, the downside is that, like, you have way too much detail in your mind. So I'm going to keep going, I promise. And we'll have, because there's a lot to say about this subject, but we'll have time, I hope, for some really good questions, and especially, you know, questions about the contemporary moment that we're in the state and with our Lumbee nation and our nation of the United States. So I really appreciate how the exhibit doesn't give us a straight line story of democracy. If you haven't seen it, please, it will really kind of change your appreciation for what people have to go through when they are creating a government that is intended to govern by the people. Lumbees have been governing in that way for hundreds of years in our current kind of political formation, way before the establishment of the United States. So we didn't really pick up anything much from the United States, but as you'll read sometimes in U.S. history, there's quite a few U.S. founding fathers that picked up some things from Native people. So we're not really going to go that far back in time, but thinking about how the exhibit represents people disagreeing, it represents a lack of unity, and also a coherence, a continued search for a shared identity. And I feel like that's a lot of what Lumbee history tells us. It's what it means to come together as a nation and find a shared identity. So today I'm going to talk more about how Lumbee engagement with democracy brings out some of democracy's dark sides. How easily, for example, a noble principle can be corrupted, and how its use can actually lead to fewer freedoms for some people. And the question I really, in case you might be new to the conversation, but this is a little map that demonstrates where Lumbee people are currently located. The shaded area is kind of our technical tribal territory. The lines is the county of Robeson, where a lot of my research centers around. And then there's a little star approximately locating us here in Greensboro. But our story involves a 44,000 square mile territory between the James River in Virginia and the Great Petey River in South Carolina. That's really our historic territory. Happy to talk more if folks have questions about that farther back in time, but this is the place that I'll really be dealing with today. So exploring this question about Lumbee engagement with democracy helps us answer this other question. Whoops, we'll get there. How do Lumbees build our sovereignty using the tools that we are given, rather than often tools that our ancestors originally created? And Glenn said this fabulous thing the other day in an interview that I just have to give him credit for, which sums up our evening so well, I think, which is that every time someone has to picture themselves as part of a system that they've been excluded from, they have to reimagine not only themselves, but also that system. And I feel like that's what Lumbee people, these ladies right here, for example, those gentlemen on the far end, you know, that document at the center, you know, really represents a crucial time for Lumbee history that I'll touch on in a minute. But these are the people that are involved in reimagining not only themselves and who they are in relation to the system, but the system itself. I want to start with this little quote from someone we all hold near and dear.
The reason there was a large migration to Guilford County was because of the textiles, Burlington Industries, Guilford Mills, and Coal Mills, the furniture industry in High Point, and the hosiery industry in High Point. There were tons of jobs, you know, for those that did not, you could come off the farm and get jobs, and you did not have to have education. And of course, what was forcing those people to come here was the mechanization of farming. You know, when everybody was being displaced by tractors and all of that stuff. And so, one night, different ones were telling that they wanted to learn how to read and write. You know, when you were asking them why they would want an Indian center. And when they finished, Johnny's passing in. He said, I'm going to pass around this paper, and I want you to write your name and your address and put down anything that you really want to, that you're interested in. He got to this man, and the man said, Mr. Reynolds, I told you I want to learn how to read and write. No, we didn't. We weren't even understanding the problem.
So that was Ms. Ruth Rebels, Jennifer's beautiful mom, talking about the origin of Guilford Native American Association. And she describes, of course, why Native people began to come to Greensboro for industry and jobs for economic reasons. But then also there was this lack of education in Robeson County that was driving them out of Robeson County. And they would arrive here and not know how to read and write. And I play this not because it's directly pertinent to self-governance, but to give you an idea of where all this really starts and why Lumbee people engage in self-governance. We do it because our people have been deprived of some basic human rights within a system that we helped build, that we've supported through military service. Mr. Lonnie serving in the military all those years, you know, being deprived of some basic human rights like education, it forces people to come up with new solutions, new creative solutions. And that was a core part of what created Guilford Native. And then also, of course, what creates the Lumbee system of democracy that the exhibit so nicely covers, and that I'll talk a little bit more about here in a minute.
The reason there was a large migration to Guilford County was because
Tell me about it. Great.
It might take a second.
This is going to just take a second to reform. It's all good. But I'm also not going to dwell too much here on the 1835 North Carolina Constitution. This sounds like a really long ago time. It's something that only historians care about. But there is a beautiful section in the exhibit on this Constitution. And the meaning of this moment to Lumbees is something that's actually been passed down more in our oral tradition than it has in a lot of written documents. So in my research, I wasn't able to find somebody putting pen and paper to how this Constitution affected our people. But even now, you know, almost 200 years later, our families have a very, very strong memory of what happened after this Constitution was passed. And the exhibit does a wonderful job of connecting the divisions within the state of North Carolina as it was expanding economically to Indian removal, to the removal of Cherokee people from further west of here, and connects Indian removal in this wonderful way to the expansion of slavery. And those two things, we don't often talk about African American history and Native American history in the same space, in the same category, but I just want to briefly highlight that the expansion of slavery and the defense of slavery in North Carolina was made possible by the mass violent expulsion of Native people from throughout the South. Lumbees happened to escape from that particular outcome of expulsion for reasons I can go into later, if you're interested. But the fundamental outcome of this constitutional revision was that Lumbee people were denied the ability to vote. The first state constitution after the American Revolution offered free people of color, free men of color, asterisk, sorry God, free men of color the ability to vote if they owned a certain amount of property. That included Native American men who were citizens, like the Lumbees. It also included African American men who that first constitution declared citizens. But then after 1835, Lumbee and African American men who were free were denied this right to vote. And in our oral tradition and in our kind of community memory, our living memory, this was a crucial time for our democracy to be yanked, our right to exercise, participate in democracy, to be yanked out from underneath us. And the ultimate consequence of this in some ways is that the state developed a kind of legal architecture for a biracial society, a society based on white and on black, free and on slave. And so if you did not fit in one of those categories, you were not accounted for essentially legally after 1835. And that sets Lumbee lives on a particular course that, again, we've never forgotten. I don't think we've ever forgiven the state of North Carolina for doing that. Disenfranchising us as well as our black neighbors. This is a particular election that didn't make it in the exhibit, and I understand why. Because its dramatic import actually has quite a lot to do with Robeson County. And as I discovered in my research, quite a lot to do with Lumbees specifically. It's less of a statewide story in a way, but it's important because it shows, this is an example, and I'll walk us through it. It shows us how, in response to democracy's failures to protect Lumbee rights, we begin to seek self-sufficiency. So we get there by starting in the Civil War, actually. 1865, picture it. Sherman is coming up from the state of South Carolina. He's burned Atlanta and done a lot of damage. The South is very worried that they're going to lose the war, which in fact they do. He's coming up from South Carolina and he's crossing the Lumber River. Now the Lumber River, if you've ever been there, it's a hard place to cross without a nice bridge or somebody, Sherman's crossing it without a bridge. He's kind of stuck in the mud, like literally stuck in the swamps in Robeson County. But the Confederates can hear cannons and guns going off, like they know that he's coming, and their ability to control that area is going to fall. In the spring of that year, as Sherman is crossing the Lumber River, a mob of white Confederates execute a man named Allen Lowery and his son William Lowery. And Allen and William and their whole family had remained Unionist loyals throughout the war. And this sort of act of revenge, in a way, precipitated this other event in Lumbee history that we call the Lowery War. So raise your hand if you know who Henry Berry Lowery is. Okay, we got a couple people. I'll go into it a tiny bit. After the murder of Allen and William Lowery, Allen's youngest son and William's youngest brother, baby brother, Henry Berry, rallied his brothers, his cousins, his wife's brothers, and created a unit that we now remember as the Lowery Gang. The Lowery Gang went about spending the next 7 years between 1865 and 1872 executing as many people as they could who were members of that original mob that executed Allen and William Lowery. The import of this, they murdered ultimately over 20 members of that mob, as well as other prominent county officials that probably weren't there at the time. But people like the sheriff, you know, they were not afraid. These folks, in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, they and their families called themselves conservative Democrats. And if you know a little bit about North Carolina political history, you know at that time the Democrats called themselves the party of white supremacy. Today they're thought of as having a very different kind of political agenda, but in the 1860s and 70s, well, up until the 1900s, they thought of themselves as the party of white supremacy. The Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, you know, the party that took credit for emancipating African American people, for example, and during the Reconstruction time period, upholding the rights of African American people to participate in democracy. The Lowery Gang was very focused on eliminating a power threat from conservative Democrats, because that was the largest political group essentially that participated in the executions of Allen and William Lowery. During this time, the state constitution was rewritten again in 1868. That was our kind of post-war, our Reconstruction Constitution. And that constitution in 1868 outlawed slavery. It enabled the state to re-enter the Union, because, you know, that wasn't a foregone conclusion. And it also, of course, included new rights for freedmen, including the right to vote. This 1868 Constitution outraged the conservative Democrat faction all over the state, including Robeson County, and positioned them as opposing the state government's goals for Reconstruction, for North Carolina's ability to re-enter the Union. That's really all Reconstruction is. It's just the ability to re-enter the federal body, nation. Henry Berry Lowery himself was known to sympathize with Republicans, and he reportedly marched in at least one political parade that supported the Republican cause. For reasons I can go into later, if you're interested, Henry Berry Lowery himself was the most wanted man in North Carolina history, essentially, except for Jefferson Davis. So Jefferson Davis, as president of the Confederacy, his bounty was a little bit higher than Henry Berry Lowery's. When he went on the run, the reward for his capture was a little bit higher. But at the time of Henry Berry's reign, essentially, the reward on his head was something like $10,000, which in 1868 is an enormous amount of money. Nobody had ever seen that kind of money. But nobody ever actually captured Henry Berry. He disappeared in 1872, rumored to have shot himself accidentally cleaning his gun, but as you can imagine, Lumbees don't really believe that, and there's less evidence for that in some ways than there is for his disappearance. And then another member of the gang, my great-great-grandfather actually, Henderson Oxendine, was publicly executed for his role in these events in 1871. So the disappearance of Henry Berry Lowery brought the Lowery War, as we call it now, to a close, essentially, a certain kind of close. And conservative Democrats saw an opportunity in Robeson County to reassert their power in a way that during the previous 7 years they had not been able to. So they began, along with other conservatives in the state, organize another constitutional convention in 1875. Because again, remember, they were outraged by that 1868 Constitution. They wanted to do away with it. So, but in counties all over the state, as the Wilmington part of the exhibit, for example, demonstrates, the contest between conservative Democrats and Republicans was very close. It was, you know, neck and neck throughout, because not only did African American people support the Republican Party, but a number of whites supported the Republican Party as well. people who had stayed loyal to the Union during the Civil War, for example. You might remember North Carolina was the last state to secede from the Union before the war began, or slightly after the war began. And much of white North Carolina had been really ambivalent at best about the Confederacy and about the control of conservative Democrats. So in 1875, state conservative leaders concluded that their ability to control this constitutional convention hinged on the outcome of the vote for convention delegates in Robeson County. And the Lowery War had basically put these conservative Democrats on the defensive, and the state party Democratic chairman, a man named William Cox, sent a telegram, which is this fuzzy writing up here, this is the telegram, sent a telegram to the county's Democratic Party chairman reading, "As you love your state, hold Robeson." So the county chairman set out for a place called Blue Springs, which is kind of in the, as soon as it appears, it's in the upper left corner there. And by the next day, the votes from Blue Springs and 3 other Robeson County townships had vanished. They had not been delivered to the courthouse, so they could not be counted for the delegates for this constitutional convention. Oops. Oh no, it's going to get there. Anyway, it'll pop up. Republican candidates, of course, there we go. These are the 4 districts where the votes were quashed, essentially. If you know Robeson County, this is us, right? It's one of the biggest townships in the county, but it's also, especially at this time, heavily Lumbee. I mean, 95% Lumbee. The other townships, there's several other that were implicated here. They were also included Lumbee voters, but I think they also included white voters who were sympathetic to the Republican Party. And in fact, when you go back and tally these votes, the Republican delegates won in those townships. So had not the votes been quashed, the whole Constitutional Convention would have been different, because it was only the Democratic candidates from this county that put the Democrats in a majority, 1-vote majority, by the way, to then pass over 30 amendments to the 1868 Constitution. And those 30 amendments, some of them changed the state's election system in a way that would keep Democrats in power until the 1970s. And again, I thought of Mr. Lonnie and his support for the Republican Party. And he was a visionary, right? Because he was one of the first Lumbees to say, we have a choice now. Maybe we should vote Republican instead of voting Democrat, because all we've been able to do is vote Democrat, right? And it was the 1875 Constitution and the missing votes, especially from Burnt Swamp Township, that put that political regime in place. This history, we're going to zoom forward, like enter the wormhole, and zoom forward in time to the late 1990s, mid and late 1990s. And our question here is really how the first Lumbee Constitution demonstrates the kind of community building and consensus that we were denied in 1875 and in other kinds of times. So this, this is about an exercise of sovereignty that before this time period we had been truly denied. Sovereignty is really the right to exercise self-governance, to decide how you want to be governed, to make decisions for your community, for the right for the people to govern. That's what sovereignty is. And it's messy. So, a native nation possesses sovereignty because it's a political community that predates the existence of the United States. That's a kind of important fact. And the Lumbees are a political community that predate the existence of the United States. It has citizens. Lumbee Nation has citizens. Those citizens have leaders. in Native nations, that leadership doesn't have to look like the United States leadership, but it can if we choose it, if we choose for it to. And as you might know, Lumbees have been fighting for full federal recognition since the 1880s, and this is what preceded the development of the Lumbee Tribe Constitution, is a new phase of that fight. And I put our first sort of bullet point is federal government versus federal government. Because people ask me, why aren't the Lumbees recognized? And I say, well, the federal government can't agree on what it means to be an Indian tribe. The Bureau of Indian Affairs has one set of criteria and one kind of process. And then Congress has not so much criteria, but it has a political process that you can engage to be recognized with a congressional act. And tribes all over the nation have been recognized both kinds of ways. And then there's several other mechanisms for recognition also, because these different branches of the federal government don't agree on what an Indian tribe should be. Talk about a system we've been given, right? Not a system that we chose or a system we created. We have to reimagine what it means to participate in that system. So amid this kind of division between the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Congress over what it means to be Native, Lumbee people have been pursuing both avenues, but in the early 1990s we were especially invested in pursuing a bill in Congress that would pass a law that would declare us entitled to the rights of sovereign Native nations. Did anybody remember Jesse Helms? Right? Okay, yay. We don't talk about him as much as we used to, but boy, I miss ranting on Jesse Helms. I have other people to rant about, but you know, Jesse Helms was always a persistent opponent of Lumbee recognition. My late husband Willie used to kind of quote him and say, Jesse always said, let the Lumbees alone, they're fine, right? So for him, federal recognition represented federal overreach. You remember that argument in Reagan years, right? And so every time it came up for a vote, he would quash the Senate's ability to vote on this bill. And it's a confusing issue. Other tribes don't always support Lumbee federal recognition. And meanwhile, tribal members like Mr. Lonnie, Ms. Ruth, and the founding members of Guilford Native have operated nonprofit organizations consistently in order to serve our citizens, because the federal government is not providing us with the acknowledgement of our sovereignty. Our sovereignty exists whether they acknowledge it or not. But when they acknowledge it, it unlocks the ability to actually provide meaningful services for your people. So Guilford Native stepped in here in Greensboro. The Lumbee Regional Development Association stepped in Robeson County to provide these services using grant funds to Lumbee citizens. And, you know, the LRDA is short for Lumbee Regional Development Association. The LRDA had been representing the tribe in federal recognition matters up until the mid-1990s, because it was really the informal leadership body that we had informally invested with that power. And one year in talking to a journalist, the LRDA executive director at the time was, you know, challenging this idea that we are not successful because we are not united. And he said, outsiders look at it as Indians not being united. The white race is not united. The Indian people have a right to debate their differences. Well, this was sort of, he didn't know how right he was going to be as we went into this constitutional creation process. After 1991, when Jesse Helms again quashed our ability to have a congressional law, a group of pastors and educators and other community leaders organized their own constitutional convention, and under the name Lumbee Tribe of Cheraw Indians. I can go into later why Cheraw, but that constitutional convention was seen as a wise move because people began to lack confidence in LRDA's ability to be successful in Congress. They began to feel, I think with good reason, that a constitutional government acting on behalf of the Lumbee tribe would be more successful in negotiating with our companion sovereign, the United States. That after 1993, this group of community leaders wrote a constitution, and it organized a vote of tribal members, and that constitution passed 8,010 votes to 223 votes. 8,000 in favor, 223 against. I mean, that's pretty, like, decisive, right? There was sort of a technical matter that I will spare you that caused LRDA to object to the Lumbee tribe of Chiraw Indians' ability to hold this vote. And then, this is the Lumbees versus Lumbees part of the story. So the federal government's not united. You know, we also have a right to debate our differences, right? People can have differences, differing opinions, and different pathways towards the same conclusion. In 1995, the Lumbee tribe of Chiraw Indians sued LRDA because of LRDA's objection to their process. And they did that because they sought an outside court's recognition of Lumbee tribe's status as the tribe's official governing body. Many people, of course, saw this move as ceding our sovereign authority to a U.S. court, to a North Carolina court. But the Lumbee tribe argued that tribal members were also citizens of the state of North Carolina, which is very true, and that the 1994 constitutional vote meant that the citizens approved the Lumbee tribe's governing authority. They wanted a state court to authorize that argument, that legal argument. They didn't win, and neither did LRDA. A very smart judge, Howard Manning, who was also the decider in the Leandro case, Howard Manning decided actually that neither body represented the Lumbee people, and that a new government should be developed with the consensus of both parties. So that decision actually upheld the principle of self-determination and native sovereignty, but not the structures we had created to exercise it. So we had to go back into that reimagining the system. And this is when Judge Manning created something called the Self-Determination Committee. Mr. Lonnie was on it, my dad was on it. There were, several dozen Native people that over the course of 2 years developed a representative government with districts that were drawn along geographic lines that reflect our centuries of settlement. So that map I showed you earlier with the townships, the geographic lines for our districts really almost exactly map onto those township lines. That's how long we've been there. That's how long we've been exercising that self-governance. And the elections process this time with our new consensus-based constitution it was really a tremendous success in historical terms. It involved 70 candidates for 24 seats. Over 9,700 people voted. 40% of the tribe's voting population. Those are not small numbers, compared to a U.S. election. So the inauguration for the new Lumbee tribal government was in 2001, and this was like an incredibly celebratory moment. And after participating for so many hundreds of years in a democratic process that we did not design, and also powerfully in sacrificing our ability to gain an education for that process, and serving in the military for that process, we were securing the blessings of liberty for other Americans, but not ourselves. So after 2001, we finally had our own democracy, our own way. And it stayed messy, it's still not perfect. But, again, people like Ms. Ruth...
It says up, which is true, that we operate like a tribe, but we're not a tribe, we're self-governing. And they also wanted us to put other people on board, and we fought that and won. He said, our purpose is, for the last 500 years, or ever how long, the white man has told us, this is what you need, this is how you do it, and we'll do it for you. And the whole purpose of the Indian centers and the tribes now with A&A is not just economic, social, cultural self-sufficiency, but governance self-sufficiency. The board members need to learn how to govern and let them, along with the community, determine the need.
So, you know, again, as one of the originators of this principle of Lumbee self-governance in the modern era, Miss Ruth, again, sums it up perfectly, not just for Guilford Native, but for the entire Lumbee nation. Why do we have self-governance? Because we've been told how to do it. And that, you know, being told how to do it or we'll do it for you, it's not going to work for us. Our votes are going to get stolen, you know, or our right to vote is going to get taken away. And what we do now, what we do persistently, is to exercise that sense of self-governance, which is social, yes. It's cultural, yes. Of course, it's about economic autonomy, the ability to read and write, always. But in this 21st century, we were able to finally, I think, access a form of sovereignty that our ancestors dreamed about, but themselves did not have the resources to marshal. And yet that, you know, democracy is fragile. I think about our pine trees as a way to understand it. If you've ever been to Robeson County, you know there's these enormous pine trees. It's one of the pine cone patchwork at the very first slide is kind of an artistic rendering of the bottom of a pine cone. And that's become a national symbol for us because that tree provides us with life and resources, but it's also in itself a symbol for our self-governance. The pine tree, longleaf pine trees, have a very deep taproot. You know, especially in Robeson County, they grow in very sandy soil, right? So the soil's not retaining a lot of water. The roots don't spread out like they do with oak trees or other kinds of trees. The root goes deep, deep into the water table in the ground. And that gives it a sturdiness that when a strong wind comes along, means that the tree's not liable to fall over. The tree will, or not liable to uproot itself, the tree will snap, right? This tree might snap in that strong wind, that instability, that system. American democracy is always on fire. and that system means that the tree might break, but it's not going to uproot itself. And that's what our constitutional government represents to me, to us. The deep root makes it possible for it to grow again and again and again. So thank you. And I would love to have questions or any thoughts you'd like to share about this story.